Hello everybody, we're happy to have you here at the Hebraica University. Today we have a very distinguished guest with us. It's a privilege and an honor that we have James Carroll with us. For those who don't know yet, Mr. James Carroll is a very important author of a book that in my case was very moving and very significant, helped me to understand the development of Christianity, of the relation of the church with the Jews, and to know a person who in the book also presents himself and his development through his life. I'm speaking about this book, Constantine's Sword, La Espada de Constantino, which its subtitle is The Church and the Jews, La Iglesia y los Judíos. So it's a huge privilege to be with you, James. Thank you for coming and sharing with us some of your ideas.
Thank you, Professor. I'll call you Danny. Is that
Danny,
okay?
it's okay.
It's a privilege to be with you. Thank you. I'm grateful to you for your respectful reading of this book, even though the story it tells is full of gravity and some sorrow, much sorrow, but also, I like to think, some hope.
Thank you. Tell us, who is James Carroll? How would you summarize something?
So, how could I answer that question? Perhaps by just saying James Carroll lives between 1943 and 2022. So in a few months I've become 80 years old. So James Carroll was born in the year that the word genocide was coined. I was born in the year that Los Alamos opened to invent the atomic bomb. And I was born in the year that the Allies turned the tide against the Axis powers in Germany. I was born in the year that the defeat of Nazism and fascism began. A momentous year. And now I'm coming into my maturity as an old man in the year when many of the struggles and problems that began in 1943 and that we thought were behind us are coming back. So actually I am defined by this public calendar in some way. Obviously I'm also defined in personal calendars, but for you and me in this conversation. And the two most important things about me are, I was born a Catholic, and religion is a defining part of my life. And 1943 was the year of the Catholic Church's great failure to oppose in significant ways the Holocaust. And I have, as a Catholic, spent my life reckoning with that failure. And can I continue to be a believing Christian with this history? And that's the great question for me as a Catholic. But also, the other important point about me, who is James Carroll, is that I'm an American, a citizen of the United States. And in 1943, for the first time, the United States Air Force, my father was in the Air Force, I grew up in the Air Force. For the first time, the United States Air Force began to deliberately bomb civilian centers of cities, which mass destruction paired with the absolute weapon, the atomic bomb, has defined the new meaning of the human condition. And we Americans are at the center of that. So, religious reckoning and reformation, and American reckoning and liberal democratic change. That defines my life. That's a very large way of answering the question, who is James Carroll? But those are the brackets in which I live.
Thank you very much for this insightful description. And I want to tell you, almost 20 years ago, you published this book.
Yes.
Tell us what moves you. You mentioned a little bit about to write a book about the relation between the mostly Catholic Church and the Jews. And what was the reaction of the first readers of the book?
Well, first, why did I write the book? And then second, what was the reaction? I wrote the book because, as I just said, as a young man, I embraced my life as a Catholic. I became a Catholic priest. In those years, the world began to reckon with the Holocaust. In the 1950s, I'm growing up. In the early 1960s, The Diary of Anne Frank, Night by Elie Wiesel, The Trial of Adolf Eichmann, the dramatic play The Deputy by Rolf Hochhuth, which accused Pius the Pope of being friendly to Hitler. These four events jolted me as a young man and made me begin to understand that the perfect church, the Holy Catholic Church, had a grievous failure at its center, a failure that boils down to its long tradition of anti-Judaism, which led to modern anti-Semitism. And that posed a great personal problem for me. How could I be part of this tradition? And of course, I had to recognize the way in which I had taken that tradition in also. My own innate anti-Judaism, my own temptations to anti-Semitism, taken for granted as a young man. So, Danny, that's my problem. Now, I became a writer. I left the priesthood to become a writer. And a writer, my kind of being a writer, is I write about my problem. And my central problem is this question: how can I be a believing Christian if Christianity is complicit in this, the greatest crime? Constantine Sword is the record of my struggling with this problem. I said to myself, I must go into the history that led to this. So, 1945, 1933, the coming to power of Hitler. No, 1895, the French contempt for Jews in France, embodied in the Dreyfus Affair. No, the early revolutions of the 19th century that included targeting of Jews despite the emancipation. No, the Crusades, when Christians defined violence as the will of God and used it against Jews, the first pogroms. No, the conversion of Constantine, the Roman Empire, to Christianity, which began a new way of expressing contempt for Jews. No, the Gospels themselves, generating conflict between the church and the synagogue, because Jesus is understood as in conflict with his own people. So what am I saying? I'm saying the problem of the 20th century takes one all the way back to the beginning of the Christian story. And it was when I began to understand that I realized I'm no historian, I'm no scholar, I'm a concerned believer, But I realized I had to do the work of history and go through these centuries, not for the sake of academic study and not for the sake of preaching to my readers, no, for the sake first of my own faith. And at the end, what I came to, of course, was the recognition that the fact that the church, my church, is flawed in its origins means that the church is human. And I am human. And the revelation for me is that the coming of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God who joins us in our human condition and who doesn't condemn us for it, who, as we know from the Hebrew Bible, takes the unfaithful spouse back again and again and again, as Hosea says. And so there's a kind of redemption in this story. It's not a redemption peculiar to me or to my faith as a Catholic, but it is particular to the tradition that begins with the Hebrew Scriptures. My discovery of the Jewishness of Jesus and my discovery of, if I can say this, the Jewishness of Christian faith helped me understand there's only one God. No, not an Old Testament God against a New Testament God, judgment against love. No. One God, Shema, the God of Israel, who was the God of Jesus Christ. And that one God is loving and forgiving. And for me, that's what this book enabled me to accept.
Do you see an evolution of the situation of the church vis-a-vis the Jews in the last 20-25 years? How do you see this area, which has for you a very existential meaning and at the same time has a very powerful meaning, because as another Catholic theology, Hans Küng, wrote, religions we can develop a kind of universalistic ethics that helps build peace, or the opposite. So how do you see the current situation of the relations between the Catholic Church and the Jews?
Well, you know, my privilege was to come of age as a young man with the time of Pope John the 23rd and the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. I was in the seminary. I was commissioned to learn what the council was teaching. And the most important teaching of the council, Nostra Aetate, was to renounce the Christ-killer charge against the Jewish people and also to affirm the permanence of God's covenant with Israel. Nostra Aetate defined the most important change in the history of the Christian church. And it was the essential change in my own psychology and my own religious faith. And the Vatican Council was, first, a response to the Holocaust. Pope John saw the church failure in the Holocaust and required the church to deal with it. That's what the Vatican Council was. But the changes of the council went so deep into the psychology and theology of the church that immediately and inevitably it generated a reaction. So the first 20 years of my adulthood were defined by a revolution of reconciliation and respect between Jews and Christians, the great Jewish-Christian dialogue, led, honestly, by Jewish leaders, Rabbi Heschel, centrally. and others. So that was the first 20 years from, say, 1960 to 1980. The reaction against the council gathered power and began to become much more dominant in the Catholic Church. And we saw that in the conservative papacies of Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. And in those years, the pushback against the reforms of the council, not just about the Jews, but also about democracy, letting go of some of the sexually neurotic teachings of the church, equality, liberal democracy, power to the people, acceptance of difference, freedom of conscience. All of these great questions generated pushback, including, alas, pushback on the Jewish-Christian dialogue. The result of that is, despite Nostra Aetate, many Catholic preachers today still preach the New Testament without reckoning with the anti-Jewish elements of it. So when the Gospels condemn the Jews for the murder of Jesus, which they do, the preachers do not know how to preach those texts against themselves. So even average Catholic or Christian believer no longer instinctively has anti-Jewish associations. Still, anti-Jewish texts define the way in which Christians hear the story of Jesus. And that is a terrible setback. And even a great figure like Pope Francis, who is the best of the product of the Catholic-Jewish dialogue, even he is at the mercy of some of these old traditions. He uses, for example, he will still use the word Pharisee as a synonym for hypocrite. Well, that's a quietly anti-Jewish slander, because the Pharisees were not hypocrites. You know what I mean. So the depth of this tradition is still not fully rooted, uprooted from the church. And in the last 20 years, as the church has been more and more at the mercy of conservative, reactionary pushback against the council, now we see it as pushback against Pope Francis. In all honesty, the anti-Jewish tradition of the church is able to come back. And we may not be finished with it, which is partly reflected in the United States where I live, in the upsurge of anti-Semitism, for example. Where is that coming from? And why? And why now? It's an old impulse of Western culture, and it's an impulse that goes all the way back to the misremembered Jesus. And the Catholic Church, as the most important custodian of Christian tradition, is not finished uprooting this part of the tradition.
You mentioned that other issue that was defining for your his personal history biographies, being an American. And facing today, like in the year that you were born, situation like the war in Ukraine that we thought that was something of the past. How do you see what's going on in the United States, the cultural wars that we are reading, the polarization between groups, and in general, in current politics and in other places, how do you see the place of liberal democracy? Are we being the last witnesses of this beautiful period in which we could flourish and develop ideas with freedom of press, or are we facing a dark future? What's your vision with your life experience and your understanding also of politics, because you wrote books about the dynamics of American politics and power?
Well, I was just talking about the tradition of anti-Judaism. Think of it as like the Gulf Stream current under the ocean, a fever, hot current of water under the ocean, well below the surface. Anti-Judaism. Every once in a while it breaks the surface. In the United States of America, the equivalent current under the surface is white supremacy, contempt for African Americans, contempt for people of color, all tied together with a kind of understanding of the culture of the United States as Christian. The joining of Christian nationalism and white supremacy. That has never gone away because slavery was never fully dealt with. The American Civil War in the 19th century was not finished because, as we know better now than we did when I was young. At the end of the Civil War, African Americans were resubjugated. Slavery was officially ended, but the subjugation of blacks, Jim Crow, was institutionalized and made permanent. And it's only now being faced. And what we're realizing is there's a strong Christian element to this, this tradition of race hatred. White nationalism embedded and embraced by Christian conservatism, which I used to think was mainly a problem with evangelical Christians, but now we see, for example, by the conservative Catholics on the United States Supreme Court, that it's also tied to a kind of Catholic reactionary tradition. So something is exploding in the United States right now, and I would say it's that Gulf Stream current, feverish, hot, breaking through the surface. Either this will lead to the final victory of white supremacy, which is one of the elements of the founding of the United States, and it will lead to the final victory of Christian nationalism, putting Jews at risk, which is also part of the founding tradition of the United States. It will either lead to the victory of those traditions or to their final defeat and the coming fully of age of what we call liberal democracy, in which everyone has rights that are respected. White, black, gay people, straight people, Jews, Muslims, people who are different. That's the struggle. Now, the fact that right now in the United States, things look very bleak, much more contemptuous populism than I ever saw before in my life, much more demagoguery, not just by Donald Trump, but by the Republican Party. Forgive me for being partisan. No, don't forgive me for being partisan. That's happening now in the United States in a shocking and frightening way. But it really only suggests, of course it's happening, because that's how deep into Western culture this final change goes. So why shouldn't reactionaries be pushing back? Of course they should push back, because what's at stake is the basic identity of our culture. And that's all the more reason why all of us have a role to play in this. People in the United States now, of all kinds, feel conscripted into the struggle for the sake of democracy. And that's what gives me hope, frankly. And because we are a democracy defined by elections, we just had an election in the United States that suggested that the forces in favor of true democracy are stronger than we feared. And so I'm hopeful going forward that we can defeat the fascist impulses in our culture, which always include anti-Semitism and white racism. We can defeat those impulses. I believe we can. If we don't, it's part of a curse on the human future. You mentioned the war in Ukraine. Of course, the war in Ukraine is not unrelated to this problem, because Vladimir Putin is an international icon of these very dark currents that run below the surface of Western culture. Vladimir Putin didn't come from nowhere. Obviously, he came from unfinished traditions of Stalinism, savage dictatorial oppression in the Soviet Union, but also the dark side of European culture, which has been surfacing like this again and again over the centuries, going back even to the Crusades. So Putin he's the crime, but he's also the evidence. And he's the evidence of something that we're all having to reckon with. So the defeat of Russia in Ukraine, for which we all pray, is a part of this world struggle right now. And let's hope that this world struggle marks the end of a 1,000-year-long tradition that has been based on impulses of violence and intolerance showing up now and then, with Jews as an important symbol of that, but also Islam, and now the great threat of liberal democracy for people who want to define themselves by their power system of race and reactionary religion. So Ukraine is the front right now, but in the United States and in Mexico, we have our versions of this struggle.
Thank you very much, James, for sharing of your wisdom, for your experience, and in this analysis, which I share completely in terms of the long duration of history. We cannot understand history on the surface. We need to go deeper and deeper to the different currents, and the approach of the long duration in history of Rodel and others helped me to understand that our conflicts are not just a 100 years conflict. There are building in the history of the Occidental world, and that we will be able to follow the prophetic voices that transform the world for the first time, thinking about the possibility of world peace with the prophet like Isaiah and many others, that in spite of the drama of history, in spite of violence and injustice, they continue to believe and to dream that peace is possible.
Yes.
So thank you very much for your words, and thank you all of you for listening to this podcast of the Universidad Hebraica of Mexico. Thank you.